The great news is that it has never been easier to design and administer surveys. The bad news is that we are now inundated with survey after survey after survey. It's as if we have become keen collectors of customer satisfaction data and all sorts of administrative information. And I've struggled at times with clients that produce lists of customers who have very little real engagement with the product or service in question, and their only incentive to participate is somehow to fill in boxes and respond to multiple choice questions. On these occasions, the response rate is low, and needless to say, it produces some very awkward moments at the end of the research process. That having been noted, done correctly with motivated respondents, there is really a wealth of information that can be provided by a survey. Incredible insights. Sometimes these even challenge current beliefs or reveal new truths. From the perspective of analytics, I think it's fair to say garbage in, garbage out. The purpose of covering survey design is to make sure that if you are tasked with creating a survey, you know what to do properly. Moreover, if you're building metrics and models based on survey information, you need to be able to assess whether the material was asked properly in the first place. As an aside, when you do see problems with another person's survey, be diplomatic for a couple of reasons. First, no survey or research initiative is perfect. There will always be issues. Second, exposing problems usually gets people defensive, and you'll be perceived as the enemy. Point out the good things, and where needed, say something like, "I really like what this section has tackled. If we run this in the future, would it be possible to also ask more regarding the competitive offerings?" and that sort of thing. My point is to be positive and constructive. Just because you can attack does not mean you should. It is usually a marathon out there, not a sprint. You're going to need people and trusted collaborators to help you achieve your goals along the way. Help them to help you.
So now we're moving from more open-ended work involved in qualitative research to a more structured approach involved in survey construction. We'll be covering a lot of ground, from the general format of the survey through to the types of questions we ask. According to Andrew Greeley, we're always taking surveys, either implicitly or explicitly, with the idea being that we're always taking in information to make sense of the world. Hence the quote, "Everyone takes surveys. Whoever makes a statement about human behavior has engaged in a survey of some sort." As a forewarning, when an organization is given the opportunity to collect data, it is not uncommon for many people to offer many questions each. The net result of this is a massive survey with little focus and remarkably little value at the end of the day. By all means, solicit input, but do not lose control either. First, go back to the end-driven research process. What is the purpose of the study? What alternatives do you have to choose from? What information will be critical to the company decision makers? Second, there will always be a lot of, "well, wouldn't it be nice to know this?" type of questions. However, as the survey length increases, three things usually happen. First, the cost of administration increases. Second, respondent fatigue increases. And third, response rate declines. So phrased differently, make sure that you ask what you need to ask, but don't ask the information that you don't need. In terms of questions that you should ask, again, go back to the end-driven research and clearly articulate what problem you're trying to solve and the alternatives that you think might be available to you. Ask yourself whether you're addressing the who, what, when, and where. Remember to get at two key questions that sound similar but produce very different answers on occasion. Why do they buy and why don't they buy? Understand this in light of your product or service as well as your competitors. Perhaps more questions can be generated by asking what will be the most and least important issues to the respondent when making a decision. And then finally, given that segmentation is critical to most marketing efforts, do not lose sight of this in building the survey. How do you plan on segmenting the results? Demographic, psychographic, geographic, or maybe behavioral? In order to achieve credibility and likelihood of participation, surveys have to open with very clear instructions regarding who's conducting the survey, the general purpose of the research, and whether the responses are going to be anonymous. Throughout the survey, make sure that you have people go through it and check to make sure that you're not having all sorts of spelling mistakes or other gaffes, because you want that survey to appear professional all the way through. For surveys that are longer, say over 1 page in length, breaking it into different components, a section A, a section B, a section C, etc., usually will increase the flow and also will reduce the perception that the survey just keeps going on and on. And then, as trite as it sounds, thank participants at the end. Especially in telephone interviewing, screening questions are in place. Most professional firms will automatically disqualify participants if they or someone in their family is employed in an advertising or market research company. People who work for a company in a related industry are usually excluded as well. For example, if you were doing a survey for the Bank of America, you would exclude people from the banking industry. In addition to these standard restrictions, there are also other screening items that can be in place. For example, if you want to survey people who drive, you might screen on the basis of whether they have a valid driver's license. Make sure that all vocabulary is simple, direct, and familiar to the respondent. I underscore respondent because sometimes when you're putting this survey together, all of this information is very familiar to you, but you need to think of it from the perspective of somebody who has not seen this before. In line with this, make sure that your instructions are very clear. Pre-test, pre-test, and pre-test to make sure that people understand the questions and the information in the survey. Start broad with your survey and then get more specific over time. And always leave sensitive and difficult questions, perhaps those dealing with income, marital status, disabilities, and so forth, to the end. In a survey, some questions don't apply to all people, and in these cases, a skip pattern is employed. For example, you could ask, have you ever been part of the military? If yes, go to question 6. If no, please go to question 7. And question 6 might ask questions regarding length of service, places of deployment, and so forth. These skip patterns can be very, very easy to set up in online tools such as SurveyMonkey or Qualtrics. Here's an example that might certainly be relevant in Arizona during spring training. We could ask people whether they attended any games this year, and their answers would then dictate what subsequent questions they would wind up answering. In terms of asking questions, we could break these down into 2 broad categories, open-ended and closed-ended. Open-ended questions take the form such as, where would you consider going on your next vacation? These questions can be really useful during exploratory research when you really don't have a strong grasp as to what some of the answers might be. The problem, though, is that the diversity of responses can be so great that it can be difficult to classify the responses into categories for analysis. For example, if we did ask that question, where would you consider going on your next vacation? Some people will say Bermuda, other people will say someplace historical, somebody else will say Europe, somebody else might say my friend's place. The long and short of it is you'll get this incredible array of information. So, certainly very useful during exploratory portions of research, but not as much so during the latter stages. We'll be focusing a lot more on closed-ended questions, and these present the respondent with a fixed number of alternatives. These can take the form of a yes-no answer, or multiple responses, a ranking, a rating, or the assignment of points to a number of categories. Because the answers are already listed for the respondent, they're usually easier to answer than open-ended questions. The other thing, of course, is that they're easier to tabulate and perform other statistical functions on. When you're asking questions, especially about behavior, be specific regarding the behavior and the time frame that you're asking about, and make sure that this is relevant to the respondent. For example, if I asked, how many times have you been to Europe this week? Most people, except the extreme jet setters, would look at you rather funny. Similarly, if I asked, how many meals have you had in the last 3 years? A lot of people would have difficulty with this. First, because it's not even clear what constitutes a meal for some people. Is it a snack? Is it a full sit-down sort of occasion? And then secondly, just trying to figure out how many meal occasions you've had over the last 1,000 days plus is going to be a little daunting for most. So make sure that you're describing the behavior properly, but also make sure that you specify the time frame as well. Sometimes you'll see a question where you're asked to select one of the alternatives. So you might see 3 types of pie, cherry, lemon lime, and apple, and you're asked to select one. The problem with this is that when you ask people to just select one, you're probably losing out on some of the information. Yes, you'll see which one is preferred the most, but you won't understand whether even the most important one isn't really liked, or whether maybe they're all really liked. So instead, in these situations, I'm a bigger fan of asking attitude-based questions. For example, in a situation like this, I would probably never have somebody just choose one, but I might have them rate each one on a scale of 1 to 5, where 1 is very bad and 5 is very good. That way I can not only see the ordinal preference, but I can also see how attractive they are on an absolute scale as well. I'm now going to go through a number of response scales, and we'll start with the itemized category scale. How satisfied are you with the current governor of Arizona? Very satisfied, quite satisfied, somewhat satisfied, and not at all satisfied. In this case, all of the items have a verbal description below the response option. Here's a scale that you'll see used a lot. It's a Likert scale, and it requires a respondent to indicate a level of agreement with a statement. For example, if my federal taxes were increased by 3%, I would be unhappy, from strongly disagree to strongly agree. Now notice that this is an itemized category scale. A true Likert scale will be an itemized category scale, and a true Likert scale will have 5 points, just like the upper one here. The lower one, anchored strongly disagree through to strongly agree, would be called a Likert-like scale, but the true Likert scale has 5 points and is anchored just like you see in the upper example there. Now, a semantic differential scale is also used a lot, and it's a scale in which the respondent is asked to rate the attitude on a scale that is bounded by 2 different adjectives. So in this situation, we could ask people about what they think regarding the current state of the government's performance, and we could anchor this with extremely poor and extremely good. As a general rule, I like to keep my poorer, worse, uglier, whatever you want to call them, options on the left-hand side of the scale. So poor to good, low to high, ugly to attractive, etc. One of the questions that comes up a lot is, how many points should the scale have? Well, you have to have enough to be meaningful, and usually this is a minimum of 5, but typically it'll be 5 or 7. But I would say, do be consistent in terms of the number of points. So whether you're switching from Likert or semantic differential or whatever, if it's a 5-point scale that you're using, use that throughout. One of the problems that arises if you're switching the number of points in your scale is that at one point in time, you'll be saying to your client or somebody in your organization, oh yeah, no, it's really important, it was 4.9. And then in another portion where it's a 7-point scale, you might say, well, yeah, it's moderately important, it was a 4.9, and people just get confused. So if you're going to use a 5-point scale, you can certainly vary whether it's a Likert scale and semantic differential scale, so you can vary that throughout the survey, but try to be consistent in terms of the number of points that you're actually using. Another question that comes up is, should there be a neutral point? And for some people, this almost seems to be a religion, and I really don't get that. My take on this is that usually a neutral point represents a legitimate feeling that someone can have. I don't really feel bad about this, I don't really feel good about it, I'm kind of in the middle. Well, if that's legitimate, why not use it? Sometimes, though, people will say, look, we need to know whether they're for it or against it. If you've got a reason why you don't want to have a neutral point, by all means, take it out. There is no edict from on high that says that you either have to have it or don't have to have it. I'll also point out that where necessary, make sure that people are able to select not applicable or don't know. Otherwise, they will select the neutral value. For example, if you ask me on a scale of 1 to 5, where 1 is lousy and 5 is great, what do I think about a new restaurant's menu? I might say, well, I've never been there. So if I've never been there, I can't really say it's bad or good. So I guess I'll give it a 3. But what I really should be able to do is select not applicable. When we talked about different types of data, I indicated that I liked interval and ratio scale data a little bit more than ordinal data because I said you can always go from interval to ordinal, but you can never convert ordinal to interval. In the same way, consider the following questions. How many cell phone providers have you had in the last 5 years? Blank providers. versus how many cell phone providers have you had in the last 5 years with a series of 3 categories. In the latter case, you can't compute a mean, you can't compute a variance, you can't do t-tests, you can't do all sorts of statistics that you could do if you had the actual number. In this situation, all you could do is plot a histogram. So where possible, if it's easy enough for the respondent to answer a question where it's open in this regard so that they can provide the actual number, do that. Certainly, do your pre-testing to make sure that they understand the question and can respond in that way. But my point is that you can always convert from the first type of question to the second, but you can never do it the other way around. Now, there are some times that broader categories, like the second question, will be appropriate. They will be quicker for the respondent to answer. Sometimes you don't need that really high level of precision. It will also put a little less stress on the respondent to come up with an answer, and also can be very useful in the case of a sensitive question such as income. So I'm not saying never use the categories, but I'm saying where possible, where profitable, by all means, keep that open and let them put the exact number in there. Sometimes you're going to ask a question multiple times, varying the wording a little bit here or there, and then take an average of these items to arrive at an overall measure of the attitude. We go through this when we're talking about scale development in factor analysis and reliability analysis. So you might have several questions worded slightly differently that are trying to tie into the same overarching construct. So as an example, we could ask people to indicate the extent to which they strongly disagree or strongly agree with a series of statements such as, I like animals, animals deserve our love, or a pet can help make a family complete. Those are 3 questions that are worded slightly different, but get at the same general construct of love of animals. I'm going to bring this forward because rankings are a legitimate way of responding to questions. My personal preference is to avoid ranking questions wherever possible. First, they can be very difficult for the respondent if there are a lot of different options. And second, a lot of people confuse what a ranking is and a rating is. So let me give you an example. If I said, please rank the priorities of the current state government in order of importance of spending, rank them in order from 1, the one you would prefer the most, to 5, the one that you would prefer the least. And all of a sudden you'll see people do this right on occasion, but you'll also see people go, well, improve healthcare, that would be a 5. Improve education, that would be a 5. State parks, I'm going to give that a 5. And so sometimes they just don't understand what a ranking is about. This is solved a little bit with the online survey methods, but I still find them to be kind of confusing. What I would do instead in a situation like this is have people rate the importance on a scale of 1 to 5 or 1 to 7 for each of these different options. When I have a ranking, I have ordinal information, but I don't have a sense as to how important these are on an absolute level or the relative difference between the options. Something that I find a little bit more useful, and it is relatively easy to conduct with the online survey tools out there, is a point allocation task. For example, if you were to distribute $100 among the following alternatives, how much would you spend on each one? And the idea would be that they would allocate a certain number of dollars to each one. In a situation like that, with an online tool, you can force it to come out to a certain number so that they can't go on unless it actually sums up to that. If it's a pen and paper task, make sure that you're specifying the total, in this case $100, for them. Otherwise, what people will do is say, well, improve education, I give that $100. State parks, $90. Environmental toxins, $95. And protect wildlife, $80. And it often won't sum up to $100.